The first conundrum awaits us, a paradox that will inform the rest of our investigation through this labyrinth. We're on the hunt for keys to investigate whether European medieval architecture has a lost history or lost function that the conventional narrative has conveniently buried. How to begin such a tremendous investigation? A good starting point is to identify periods in history where a transition could have occurred, a potential moment where these structures changed significantly. This means we need a timeline. We also need to establish some scope. Medieval architecture is far too vague a term. There is too much generalization here. Medieval architecture encompasses fortifications, city walls, tunnel systems, domestic edifices, and religious sites. We are going to start with the ecclesiastical structures, the cathedrals, minsters, abbeys, monasteries, churches, and chapels. For instance, if the cathedrals had a long and hidden interaction with water, whether it was for energy production, occult practices, or something else, this interaction had to cease at some point. There had to be a moment of change when these structures became the sites we know so well today. For anyone familiar with the history of European medieval architecture, there are three obvious choices when it comes to identifying a potential point of transition. The first point of transition is the immediate period following the end of the Middle Ages, in the 1400s. We can call this period the aftermath. The second is the birth of an exclusive Gothic style of architecture. Before the 1100s, most medieval ecclesiastical structures were composed of a very understated and modest style of masonry, utterly beautiful. In Europe, it's called Romanesque. In Britain, it's referred to as Norman architecture. It utilized the rounded arch. However, in the 1100s, a unique Gothic style began to dominate. The Gothic style is primarily defined by the exclusive use of the pointed arch, rib vaulting, and flying buttresses, those half arches that support the structure. Why did this occur? The rise of the Gothic style in the 1100s is our second point of transition. The third and final point of transition is the Gothic Revival, or Victorian Restoration, that gained momentum in the 19th century and resulted in the widespread restoration of almost all medieval structures in Britain. Almost 80% of them, to be a little more precise. Of course, the timeline here and the proposed points of transition rely on us to believe what's written in the history books. How can we be sure the timeline is correct? How can we determine just how old these structures are? Is the timeline fabricated and imposed upon these structures, or do they actually speak the same story? What is a stone actually telling us? Let's find out. It's time to examine our first conundrum of the labyrinth. The Ship of Theseus is a paradoxical thought experiment that asks whether an object, in this case a ship, that has had all of its components replaced remains fundamentally the same object. If the Ship of Theseus were kept in a harbour and every part of the ship were replaced one at a time, would it then be a new ship? When it comes to these medieval ecclesiastical structures, this paradox is particularly pertinent. Although not all medieval religious structures adopt the cruciform, the shape of the cross, it does tend to be the most common structural layout. This section of the cruciform structure is called the nave. The word nave comes from the medieval Latin navum or navis. The etymological root of navis means ship. In his fantastic book, writer Christopher Somerville calls Britain's cathedrals the ships of heaven. Britain's medieval ships of heaven are all, in their own way, the ship of Theseus. It's no great secret that Britain's medieval cathedrals are maintained by a set of on-site masons. They are continually replacing the damaged and end-of-life stone blocks on these structures. After 200 years of such maintenance, how much of the original structure remains? Would a cathedral still be the same cathedral if all of its aging blocks had been imitated perfectly and replaced? Over a long period of time, this may end up a reality. Restoration masons use the same original stone type. Once it weathers and ages, how will we tell what is new and what is original? Is it still the original structure if new forms of gargoyles and decoration have been put in place by restoration masons? The ship of Theseus, the ships of heaven. And, as you're about to see, it goes a lot deeper than mere preservation. And we need to look at these significant changes if we want to investigate whether the cathedral, as a form in and of itself, once had a hidden past that has been deliberately neglected by the history books, especially if that past was related to water. We need to locate and explore all substantial points of transition, starting with our first three obvious choices. Almost all of the great medieval ecclesiastic structures in Britain are a collage of different time periods and styles. One of the primary stylistic fusions is between that of the Romanesque or Norman and then the later Gothic style. Many historians do not agree when it comes to ascribing a date for the inception of Romanesque Norman-style architecture. Some ascribing it to early in the Middle Ages and some later. But what is important is that Gothic began to dominate in the 1100s here. Hereford Cathedral illustrates this collage of styles perfectly. The oldest surviving parts of Hereford are its south transept and central nave. These are the Norman areas of the structure. Here is a photograph of the south transept, and these two arches here are distinctively Norman. As you can see, this part of the cathedral is evidently a lot older than the rest. We also see a Gothic arch in direct contrast with this rounded arch. And we see the tracery of the Gothic arch is a lot less weathered. And although very weathered, you can see a key stylistic imprint of Norman architecture here. If we venture inside Hereford to an area that's not been exposed to the elements, you can get a feel of this vocabulary. Enormous and squat rounded piers and rounded arches, with bold geometric chevrons or zigzags reminiscent of electric volts or chains. The Romanesque Norman style is characteristically very different from the Gothic. It does not feature copious amounts of detail and decoration. It does not use its decoration to convey religious motifs. It emphasizes stark geometry. When it does incorporate sculpture, it appears pagan in contrast to the later Gothic style. And the majority of Britain's oldest cathedrals and abbeys carry imprints of this early Norman style, before Gothic became dominant in the 1100s. There are two kinds of medieval cathedral in England, ones that are a fusion, part Norman and part Gothic, and others that are primarily Gothic. Lichfield was originally a Norman cathedral, but it was razed to the ground in 1195 and replaced by the Gothic structure we see today. The rise of the Gothic is our first potential point of transition. Why did this stylistic change occur? Is it worth pursuing as a genuine moment of significant change? And can we trust the timeline they give us here? We need to verify the legitimacy of the historical timeline. Construction of the Norman version of Hereford Cathedral began in 1080 and the Gothic extension in 1226. The entire site is constructed almost entirely from local sandstone that has a beautiful but subtle red pigment. Here is a very simple geological map of Britain, with an emphasis on sandstone and limestone. In Scotland, we have primarily sandstone and granite. We then have a big band of limestone that runs throughout England. On the west, we have sandstone and slate, and the southeast is primarily chalk and flint. The medieval masons were very smart and efficient. The stone they used to build each one were in full swing during the 1100s, so it was time for an upesque an architecture. It's part of its style evoking not have wanted cameramen on. Earlier, Leominster has 3 naves. This is the oldest Norman nave. This is the south or central nave. And here is the third, referred to as the south aisle, a later Gothic upgrade but more a nave in structure than an aisle. This is a pre-restoration photograph taken in 1860 of the east end of the 2 south naves. And here is a photograph taken in 1889 of both these naves after restoration. One of the central changes here is the reformulation of the stalls. They are no longer 2-tiered and dominating the space as we see in 1860, but now have a graceful spaciousness in 1889. However, there are also 2 other changes that are very significant. The first is the remodelling of the piers here. As you can see in the pre-restoration shot, these piers were originally rounded, but have been transformed into a more suitable Gothic style. Can you spot the second significant change? That's right. In 1860, we see that the entire walls, including the piers, are covered in white plaster. In 1889, after restoration, we see that the underlying stone of the masonry has been restored. Now, an initial reaction might be to query the validity of these photographs. How do we know they are genuine and not fake? But let's not be hasty. For you see, I was very lucky to stumble on 2 images of the priory mid-restoration. It was like finding buried treasure. Again, these are held in archives and only published in certain books. And you can see in both images, the naves are a mess. They have gutted the former stalls from the area, the ground is uneven, and the rounded piers are still in place at this moment. And what does this tell us? It is evidence that yes, dramatic work was undertaken on these medieval structures in the 19th century. But it also tells us that work had been carried out before the Victorian restoration began and Gilbert Scott got his hands on the project. Someone plastered these walls and piers at some point earlier than the 19th century. And if you begin to hunt down journals and correspondence of the time, the picture starts to form with a little more clarity. In an Archaeologia Cambrensis journal that was published in 1853, 9 years before Gilbert Scott accepted the Leominster Commission, we learn from Edward Freeman that Leominster's uncleanly whitewash is less offensive to the eyes than the pewed, galleried, plastered and scored neatness of the adjoining portions, which has destroyed the evidence of masonry. 9 years before its restoration began, Freeman confirms for us that the stone interior of Leominster's walls were indeed plastered, whitewashed, and covered by an abundance of galleried seating. And it seems that this was the typical condition of medieval sites in the 19th century. Speaking in 1866, the Archdeacon of Hereford called their walls the plague spot of British churches. Their thick coats of white and brown plaster. And if you start visiting medieval sites, you might see a lot of these incisions on the stone. I call these plaster scars, deliberate cuts to ensure the plaster adhered to the stone. In a circular letter from the Restoration Committee in 1862, before the work began on Leominster, the committee stated that the stone work must be denuded of its thick coatings of whitewash, but without removing the ancient painting which in many parts exists below it. And then in Eric Turton's analysis of the restoration, we get our first smoking gun. It is probably that Scott, who had mentioned paintings in his report, repeated the instructions he had issued at Hereford a few years before, that the uncleanly whitewash was to be removed by chemical means. He also stressed that if any wall paintings were found, these were to be inspected by the architect. The work was commenced, and, sure enough, wall paintings were found. Unfortunately, the workmen started to remove the plaster on which they were painted. When Scott heard of this, he called an immediate halt to the work and appointed Mr. Chick, a Hereford architect, to act as a clerk of works, having held a similar post under Mr. Scott at Hereford Cathedral. There seems to be no record of the paintings that were destroyed. That right there is a smoking gun. Why? Let's lay it out. We learn that Gilbert Scott had a high degree of control over the restoration process. During a similar restoration project at Hereford Cathedral, Gilbert Scott had issued strict orders. If any paintings were found, as the workers removed the whitewash from the walls, the work be immediately halted, and that he be immediately informed, so he could inspect them. Not only that, but when this happened at Leominster, Scott called a partner architect, Mr. Chick, to assist him like he did at Hereford. I understand the strict control over preserving historical artifacts, but why did Scott and Chick not call in a historian or archaeologist? Were they really that qualified to assess the paintings? And it's convenient, isn't it, that the workmen just so happened to destroy the paintings despite the strict orders from Gilbert Scott to cease working if they found any. Is this why mid-restoration photographs are rare? Because perhaps it presented a risk of creating records of paintings and who knows what else that they did not want to be documented. And here is where the plot thickens even more. The whitewash they were removing via chemical means existed on top of the plastered walls. And you see this across medieval sites in Britain. Faded and partially corrupted paintings on top of plastered walls. But then there is also visual evidence of the actual stonework of these structures being painted at some point in time. So we have a trajectory of stone being painted directly, and then at some point the stone was plastered over, which then was also painted on, and then this was also subsequently whitewashed. And all of this happening at some stage before the 19th century. What paintings was Scott protective over that he called an immediate halt to the restoration? The paintings on the plaster under the whitewash, or potential paintings that existed below the plaster and on the stone itself? What could have been painted on these walls? In the mid-restoration photographs, we see some kind of pattern on the ceiling here, and the quality is not good enough to assess whether these are paintings or just structural damage. But we do see here before the restoration began that the ceiling was plastered and whitewashed. And it's curious as to why they replaced the rounded piers here in the central nave with brand new ones, especially when the budget was tight and, as Turton explains, the inhabitants of Leominster stepped in to help with the finances. It's interesting that at sites like Ludlow we see the stone piers directly painted on. Could these rounded piers have had some interesting paintings on them? We'll never know. The story of Leominster's restoration also offers us another big lead. In the Archaeologia Cambrensis Journal of 1853, Freeman muses on the curious ground level of the Norman nave, the oldest part of the structure. The ground has probably been raised, he says, as the floor certainly has within, where it conceals the bases of the piers. Again, Freeman is writing 9 years before Gilbert Scott was on the scene, and the piers he is referring to are these ones here. And in the Leominster newspaper of August 7th, 1885, a report on the restoration reads, "The Norman nave was in a state of great dilapidation. The floor was uneven, and the magnificent columns were buried 1.5 feet in soil, which had accumulated around them." Why was the Norman nave buried 1.5 feet so the bottom of the piers were not visible? Now, before you start being hasty and shouting about a mud flood cataclysm, remember that this was only in one specific area of the structure, the Norman nave, and listen to what was found underneath. As we come to learn, it was not soil accumulation that raised the ground. The floor presented problems owing to the burial vaults built underneath, probably in the 18th century, as the crowns of the arches of these were higher than the original floor level. Permission had been granted to remove the crown of these arches, and the whole floor was sealed by a layer of concrete. The floor was then covered by encaustic tiles in red and black made by Goodwins of Lugwardine. This is another smoking gun. Why? Because firstly we learn that during the restoration they filled the undercroft of the Norman part of the structure with concrete and finished it with Lugwardine encaustic tiles. These red and black tiles are found everywhere across medieval ecclesiastic architecture in Britain. They were a result of the Victorian Restoration and made in factories with moulds and Portland cement that contains a high degree of mineral colour pigmentation. And secondly, because we learn that alterations to the undercroft had actually taken place in the 18th century, the 1700s, which resulted in the ground level being raised by 1.5 feet. Not only that, the alterations included an arcade of arches installed underneath the nave in a manner that did not consider the preservation or integrity of the site, which means they were not original to the structure's infrastructure. Leominster Priory is surrounded by a generous space. It would make more sense to extend the plot around the site for burials rather than undertake significant structural work underneath the priory. Could something else have driven those in the 1700s to alter the undercroft of the Norman nave? The 1700s is not one of our obvious potential points of transition. With this new information in mind, however, this period now becomes a lead and needs investigating properly. It also further deepens the Ship of Theseus conundrum. And what is very interesting is if you visit many medieval structures and pay attention to the flooring, you'll notice that the pipes for the radiators run underneath the flooring and follow lines with intermittent grills that provide easy access in case of repair. And if you look closely through the grills, you'll find that a good portion of these structures have red brick infrastructure. This red brick is not older than 200 to 300 years. You also sometimes see this from the exterior. I always thought the undercroft of these sites must have been revised during the Victorian Restoration, and a lot of them were. But as Leominster demonstrates, the Victorians were just as baffled as I am today at some of the revisions that had taken place before their time. As Freeman wrote of Leominster in 1858, it is perhaps too much to expect to be able to account for every botch and seam in the building, which has undergone so much damage and mutilation. These are pretty much the same thoughts I have as I journey from site to site. The Victorians were just as confused as we are by the ships of heaven, the way they had been damaged, altered, revised and appropriated. All of this suggests that if a great reset did occur, it happened much earlier than the 19th century, and that there were generations before who inherited and abused medieval architecture. But it is also too early to draw conclusions in regards to whether it was during the 19th century that a function or history surrounding these structures was potentially lost. The Victorian Restoration, as you have just seen, is full of clues and potential keys, and this warrants further investigation. And the case of Leominster really begs the question as to why the structure was in such a bad state to begin with, and why 80% of Britain's ecclesiastic structures needed restoration during the 19th century. Which now leads us to our final potential point of transition. The medieval Middle Ages, or Dark Ages, came to an end around the 14th century. It started with famine, and then came the plague, and then the aftermath of revolt and war. The worldwide population was reduced by over half, and it took until the 1500s for the European population to regain the levels of 1300. And it was during the 200-year period that followed, which historians have called the Renaissance, that the world changed forever. A great reset. Everything changed. It's here where we find gaping omissions, cultural discontinuity, and abrupt change. It's during this period we see the rise of pseudo-masonry, which would go on to architecturally replace most of our medieval heritage over the course of the centuries that followed. In Old French, the word Renaissance means rebirth. It stems from the Vulgar Latin renasci, which means be born again, rise again, reappear, be renewed. Who or what rose again? The Renaissance began in Italy and gradually spread throughout Europe. It reached the United Kingdom late, at the turn of the 16th century, the 1500s. Do you know what happened to the country during this era? The dissolution of the monasteries, where the medieval United Kingdom was ravaged, broken, where its old ways ended, where the ships of heaven were pillaged and laid to wreckage and ruin. The dissolution of the monasteries, a king's legacy. There are traces of around 188 ruined monasteries to be explored in the United Kingdom today. Before this happened, there were over 800 monastic sites across the island. 800. Where did they all go? And why did this happen? What happened to our medieval heritage? And why were many medieval cathedrals that are still standing today spared this barbarity? Still, to this day, the water runs through many of these ruins like it did centuries ago. This period, what I call the aftermath, is of utmost importance, and we will need to look at it in great depth, something we cannot do right now. It's our most obvious point of transition, but ironically, it poses the most challenge because the monasteries are in complete ruin, and there is a lot of historical discontinuity during this time period, a heap of broken images. Have you ever seen the 19th century photography of Roger Fenton? It's truly remarkable to see the Victorians leisurely taking their afternoon air amongst the monastic ruins. I have never seen the ruins in this way. Look how overgrown they are. Nature reclaimed them years and years before the Victorians. Ivy running high on broken walls, gnarled tree trunks firmly rooted between piers. The branches full of the leaves that may have once graced these sites in carved stone. The monasteries don't look like that today. Cleaned up. A good day out, most still sit around with the same indifference we see here 150 years ago. But perhaps now and then one or two perplexed and pensive minds, just like Edward Freeman at Leominster, just like myself today, asking the same old question: what happened? In April 2019, one of the great ships of heaven caught fire and burned for hours. Notre Dame. 2019 was the 666th year since the Black Death ended in 1353. A coincidence? A reminder? An omen? What else happened in the year 2019? Will Notre Dame still be the same cathedral even if they rebuild the spire exactly like the original? The ship of Theseus, the years of revision, alteration, destruction, reconstruction. We've made a start, but what a conundrum. We need to sift through and analyse all these timeframes properly before we can even begin to speculate about a lost function or history. And we can't forget the 1700s. We've now reached our first junction of the labyrinth. We've opened 3 paths. And, wait a second, what's that glistening on the floor? Ah, someone has left us a key. It looks like a placard from Lincoln Cathedral. Let's read it together. In Lincolnshire, the grandest and possibly most visited churches are called Cascade churches. In each Cascade church, there will be information on equally welcoming stream churches not far away, inviting you to experience their special atmosphere. At each stream church, you will find information on nearby pool churches, every one of which actively welcomes visitors. Well, that's interesting. Is someone suggesting that the ships of heaven were once connected by a water network in some way? or that they interacted with water in 3 different ways depending on their size and type. Or perhaps it's just another coincidental dead end. We'll look into it later. Back to our first junction. On the right we have the path of the arch, our first point of transition. On the left we have a route into the Victorian Restoration. And the central opening is a road straight into the aftermath. So many potential routes to lead us deeper into this thing. I feel like we are going to start becoming overwhelmed in such labyrinthine complexity. But no mind, I want you to pick the path we take. But be careful now, once we move forward, it might not be that easy to retrace our steps back to here. Have a break and think it over, and let me know once you've decided.